Over the coming decades, how we produce, move, store, and use energy will change, perhaps profoundly. And Atlantic Canada wants to be at the forefront of this change by becoming a global leader in green hydrogen. Our region wants to develop a hydrogen industry that can grow our economy, reduce emissions, and diversify our international trade, which is even more important today in light of President Trump's trade war with Canada. But the road to that future is anything but straightforward. The technology is promising, but still expensive. The market for hydrogen is emerging, but uncertain. And politics don't always align with the long-term planning that a transformation like this demands. So in this episode of Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Journey, we're taking out our crystal ball to explore what the future might look like for hydrogen in our region. We're not going to try to predict the future. Rather, we're going to discuss what's feasible, what's possible, and how we can help create the hydrogen future we want. My guest today is Michelle Robichaud, president of the Atlantica Centre for Energy, a not-for-profit organization that represents Atlantic Canada's largest energy producers and consumers. For full disclosure, she also sits on the board of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance, which gives her both a broad view of Atlantic Canada's energy landscape and a sharp focus on hydrogen's role within it. I want to begin with an obvious disclaimer that the future is uncertain, and our crystal ball is at best a little bit cloudy. That's always been true in the energy industry. It is especially true of energy transitions, and it is definitely true when we're talking about an emerging energy sector like hydrogen. But even with that uncertainty, we can look at what's happening today and envision what might come next. So, Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, Derek.
Okay, let's start with the big picture. When you think about Atlantic Canada's energy future, where do you think hydrogen fits in?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I would like to take it in two pieces. One, let's start with Atlantic Canada's energy future. So, what we know is that the region has world-class energy resources. If we look at wind, hydro, even nuclear, biomass, perhaps even tidal and solar. And that infrastructure that supports the potential around the energy sector, like tidewater ports, our existing transmission systems, that can really help us deliver that energy globally. And honestly, I do think Atlantic Canada is a bit of a sleeping giant in Canada's energy system. But what we need is maybe something to wake it up. And right now, that focus on energy security and sovereignty is really top of mind for a lot of jurisdictions. And I might suggest that's the alarm clock. So I think we'll start there, and I don't know if you want to poke a little bit further on that, because I'm happy to talk about sort of how hydrogen fits in as well.
Well, you made the point about energy security, and I think that's really becoming top of mind now. Germany, for example, they're as interested in green hydrogen for energy security as they are for emission reductions. They want to replace natural gas that they used to buy from Russia, and they want to replace it with green hydrogen and other types of gases that they can purchase for the long term, but really importantly from countries that are secure and can be reliable trading partners for them. So that's a change that's really happened over just the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I would agree. Germany is not alone in that transition, and there's a lot of countries that are looking for solid trading partners. And so while I know we're trying to make a lot of progress on a lot of energy related files, I do see developing hydrogen as a major export commodity a real option for Atlantic Canada. And if we look at, you know, how Atlantic Canada fits into that broader global market, Canada is really contemplated as that safe, reliable trading partner. And Atlantic Canada, specifically, I think, can meet some of those needs. We talked about the infrastructure that's available, those world-class wind resources. If we look at near term, we have so much potential for onshore wind, but in the longer potential, there is offshore wind, and with our ice-free deep water ports and that strategic location, Germany and all of Western Europe actually should be very interested in what we have to offer here in Atlantic Canada. But
Yeah,
here's
and
something. Oh, sorry,
uh,
go ahead.
yeah, I think we need to start thinking about wind differently. We have a resource-based economy in Atlantic Canada, and we've had oil, we've had natural gas in the past. We have a strong forestry sector and a strong fishing sector. So we think about kind of extracting these resources and then we sell them usually abroad. We tend to not think of the wind as a resource that way, but it maybe is the best resource that we have. But obviously you can't just export the wind. You can't put it in a vessel and just send it. So you've got to turn that wind into something. And we know we can use the wind to generate electricity, but we're also not going to we're not going to export electricity to Europe directly. So thinking
Mhm.
about green hydrogen as a way to turn wind, this resource we have, into a resource that we can actually export and trade, I think is a really important concept, and green hydrogen certainly offers that opportunity.
Yeah, I really like the idea of thinking about that as a natural resource that we have here in the region, because I think if we think of it that way, it's much more of a longer play. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies or the talk tends to be about, short-term things. And even this, the U.S.-Canada relationship right now, we're having some bumps, and there's a really big push on that sort of sovereignty and the energy security piece. I do think that provides an opportunity to turn that into a longer term vision. But what I guess I need to give a little bit of kudos to both the region and specifically the provinces of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, as well as New Brunswick, who have really been trying to push the hydrogen agenda for a number of years. They see that as a real opportunity. And if we look at, in addition to having a really great natural resource like wind, and some of the infrastructure, albeit we're going to need to make some investments in that infrastructure. Um, we have private investors who come to the table. And I, in your previous episode, you had on Trent Beachy, and I think that's a really important part of this really complex nascent sector that is developing, is that when you have companies that are making investments in our region, that should be demonstrating to the people who are in those areas and the provinces and the federal government that there is a real opportunity here. There's been investments made. And if we take that long term play, for me, you're having investments in existing infrastructure. You're developing something that even if, we have a little slow down because that happens, markets change. You're still making investments in something that can be used for something else. And we've kind of seen that with some of these investments. It's how do we do methanol, ammonia, and whatnot. And I think that's really important because we are flexible here. So I'm going to stop because I think we could probably keep going on this tangent for a bit.
Let's talk more about the economic opportunity. I mean, both the federal government and the provincial governments in Atlantic Canada, are really bullish on the hydrogen sector. Premier
Mhm.
Tim Houston in Nova Scotia views green hydrogen as a way for Nova Scotia to become an energy powerhouse. And Newfoundland and Labrador believe that the development of green hydrogen really presents a transformative opportunity for the province. So there's tremendous economic potential.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to know what role you think hydrogen can play in Atlantic Canada's vision to become an energy powerhouse.
Yeah, we believe that Atlantic Canada can realize some of the benefits of its natural resources and certainly its history as a bit of an energy powerhouse, although I think a bit of an underdog as well. I think the efforts that the premiers have been making recently, the work on those internal trade barrier files, that at the same time they're doing that, they should be championing a bold, a unified energy vision for Atlantic Canada. For this region really to be a leader in the energy transition. Certainly, we've talked about it, Atlantic Canada is well positioned to not only supply itself, and I think that's an important piece that we can talk about maybe a little bit later, but also the world with that clean, secure, and competitively priced energy. The region already produces low carbon offshore oil, hosts the largest oil refinery in Canada, and houses the first liquefied natural gas terminal in the country. So if we look at our history on the energy file and the assets that we currently have, combine those with that natural resource, I really think that it represents a transformational economic opportunity.
Right. And as we've been talking about the economic opportunity, we've been focused a lot on producing green hydrogen for export, primarily to Europe. But historically, Atlantic Canada has been a net energy importer. We've relied on imported fossil fuels typically to meet our energy needs. And green hydrogen also offers us an opportunity to become more energy independent through the energy transition.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are opportunities for us to produce green hydrogen and use it here in Atlantic Canada to decarbonize energy uses that will be really hard to decarbonize with electricity alone, like heavy transportation, some industrial processes, marine vessels, the whole fishing sector, etc. So one of the things I've been focused a lot on is how do you develop that domestic opportunity? It's really hard to do when you're starting from
Mm-hmm.
scratch.
Yep.
And focusing on hydrogen hubs is a really important way to do that. So there are strategic locations like Halifax or St. John, New Brunswick, or around the Port of Baldoon that can develop a robust hydrogen value chain by co-locating hydrogen production and delivery and end use kind of all in one geographic area. And
Mm-hmm.
there are really good opportunities to do that. If you look at the city of St. John, where you are, as an example, St. John is a port city. It is already home to several large and small industrial facilities. It's already a regional energy hub with the Irving Oil Refinery, which, by the way, is Canada's largest producer and user of hydrogen today. St. John also has the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station and an LNG terminal. So it already has many of these kind of energy assets that would be important in developing a hydrogen hub. And so I think St. John is a really promising location to develop a hub. These hubs often start small, but then
Mm-hmm.
they scale up over time. So I could see over the next 3 to 5 years developing a hydrogen hub in the Halifax area and the St. John area. And then, over the longer term, the Port of Baldoon, I think, has a good opportunity to develop a hub. And there are a couple of locations in Newfoundland that could be good locations as well.
I would agree with you, and sometimes when we point out those specific locations, um, and I don't know why this is, but sometimes people kind of get their backs up or they think it's a competitive type of environment. Well, we want to be the first hub, and that's all. That's great because maybe it does generate that want to be first. But our organization firmly believes in collaboration and working together in terms of being able to bring a larger game, I guess, play that larger game. But I think that there is an opportunity to maybe start small, right? So maybe let's test out some of those things and let's have the whole region watching that develop and really working together. If we can, for example, get hydrogen as a key strategic opportunity for economic growth, we've got agreement and alignment in the region that hydrogen is part of that, that it's part of our environmental sustainability and our climate goals, then having these kinds of hubs and building infrastructure around them, it makes a lot more sense because hydrogen will then get embedded into those long-term
Right.
plans for the region. The province will hop on side. Communities will see the opportunity. First Nations will hopefully be part of that and invest and partner on future energy projects. And you talk about supply chain. If we really coordinate our efforts and try and understand that the potential there and work together and not have this sort of competitive nature, I think there's a lot that we can see from an economic standpoint for sure.
We also heard from Dave McGregor in the first episode of the podcast where he talked about exporting green hydrogen to Europe and using hydrogen domestically as complementary, not competing goals. And so the point he
Mhm.
made was that if we export hydrogen to Europe, that can help fund hydrogen infrastructure here in Atlantic
Right.
Canada, similar to how American customers helped finance a Sable offshore energy project, 20 years ago or so. In this same way, this infrastructure is going to be expensive. So if we can scale it up, get the European customers to pay for some of that infrastructure, then we can benefit from it here locally too.
If you're producing clean or green hydrogen, it's certainly an attractive investment pitch for developing
Uh,
new industry. So outside of even the hydrogen piece of it, the idea of having green energy hub where you bring in companies to develop green steel or, other interesting clean and green industries, I think that would really benefit the entire region. And just to go back to your point about the idea of creating it here and using it domestically, if we look at how we might lower the carbon intensity of natural gas, and natural gas is still a really important part of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick's energy system. If you blend hydrogen into our natural gas system, and we can do that because we have the newest pipes that are able to accommodate hydrogen, and so certainly there's an option there to not only use it domestically to decarbonize, but then think about how industry can develop around that.
uh,
If you also look at some of those other sectors that could be developed, maybe we'll see some of the work that New Brunswick is doing on small modular reactors, sort of positioning New Brunswick as a clean energy leader and innovator. Perhaps we'll see some of the offshore skills that have been developed in Newfoundland and Labrador's sector to develop our offshore wind resources. So many people don't. They think that maybe the hydrogen economy is going to develop. We're going to need brand new skills. They're all very similar skills to what we have. We just might need to tweak them a little bit. And so I think we need to be thinking big in terms of how do we utilize what we have and attract more investment and really try and shift a bit of the energy sector to a cleaner version of what we're really good at anyway.
we've been talking about the opportunity and what's possible. Let's talk about what we're going to need to do to realize that opportunity. Building the hydrogen industry is going to take more than just investment and technology. We're also going to need, policies and regulations and trust from Atlantic Canadians and probably a lot of political will to bring a hydrogen economy to life here in Atlantic Canada. We've heard other guests on this podcast say that political will and regulatory alignment is really going to be essential. I'm interested in your thoughts on what kind of policy and regulatory certainty are hydrogen investors and developers going to need to see here before they will be prepared to move forward with confidence?
Yeah, you know, I'm part of a lot of conversations on the energy sector in general, but also on hydrogen. And what we hear is that investors want to invest. They want to invest in a place that has predictable and consistent policy. And in order, I think, to fully realize the potential of green hydrogen here in Atlantic Canada, we need that regional coordination and collaboration. This is a new industry developing. We can't develop it in silos. There really needs to be a cohesive regulatory landscape. Each province doesn't need to go out and develop their own regulations, codes, and standards. That will create a lot of unnecessary barriers that we've seen help or impede the growth in the sector and also in the region. It can increase costs, can delay project timelines, and at the end of the day, discourage investment.
Right. And I
Our
hope that, in this environment where Atlantic Canada's premiers have, committed to removing interprovincial barriers that restrict trade and inhibit development, they'll kind of, seize this moment. Eliminating barriers in long established sectors, that's difficult. But the hydrogen sector is a rare opportunity to prevent those barriers from ever being erected.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that the Atlantic Canadian provinces will develop regulations in the hydrogen sector collaboratively, work
Mhm.
together to develop regulations and codes and standards so that you don't have this misalignment. Because I think from an investment standpoint, the risk in that is if an investor looking to come to Atlantic Canada and they see four different sets of regulations and codes and standards in four provinces, they're likely to say, well, why come here? I could go to Ontario or Alberta or BC. It's a much bigger market and only have to deal with one set.
Exactly. And we need to remind them about that natural resource that we do have. But that's that's not the only thing that's going to win us in this global race, I guess, for those investment dollars. I would also just highlight that recently the Atlantic Economic Council did a major projects inventory of, what is possibly on the books here in Atlantic Canada. And there's more than $40 billion in energy projects in that pipeline, metaphorically speaking. And, that 40 billion jobs can create, $40 billion can create a ton of jobs, attract investment, and sustain communities for generations. I I think it's really important that we talk about how do you communicate and, get the public on side. And you mentioned that earlier. For me, that's a really important part of how we're going to get to where we want to be, both on the hydrogen side, but on the energy side in general. We really need to have a collaborative or long-term plan that will communicate why it's so important that we focus on energy being an economic driver. We recently did a study at the Atlantica Centre for Energy, and one of the staggering facts that we found from the survey is that only 25% of Atlantic Canadians rate themselves as highly knowledgeable about energy in their region. And I know that we only worry about the energy um, when when we're thinking about electricity on the most part because we pay our bills every month. Perhaps when we go to the gas tank to fill up our vehicle. But other than that, most people don't think about energy. And so if we can have some sort of collaborative messaging, perhaps some energy literacy resources that will help them develop their knowledge base, I think that can only help. what we're trying to do here in the region.
Right. We also have a lot to do to develop the whole supply chain, and workforce is a big part of that, and we're going to have to develop it, largely from scratch. But on the point you made around workforce, a lot of the skills and experience that will be needed by the workforce in the hydrogen sector is similar to the skills and experience that's needed today in the oil and gas sector. We have a lot
True.
of Atlantic Canadians that are working in Western Canada, in the oil patch. They will have an opportunity to, bring their skills and experience back home to Atlantic Canada and
Yep.
apply those skills and experience, probably with a little bit of retraining, into a
Mhm.
completely different energy sector. And I think that's hopefully a very inspiring opportunity for Atlantic Canadians.
Yeah, I would agree. And I've heard told that um, our First Nations communities have the youngest and fastest growing workforce. So wouldn't it be great if we can work collaboratively with our First Nations and Indigenous communities in the region to really help them grow their interest in and contribution to the energy sector and that growth. But I also think that young people in general really don't understand where the opportunities are. And so I do think that there needs to be a bit of a concerted effort to uh, educate and provide information about where the opportunities are for our young people, so that workforce of tomorrow, and then also inform the general population about those opportunities, because as we all know, young people tend to be influenced, as much as they don't want to admit it, by by their parents, by their grandparents, and those who are.
Okay. Let's end by kind of looking into a cloudy crystal ball in the future. So it's, in 2025, the hydrogen sector is only starting to emerge. What do you think success might look like in 2035? So, what could a thriving hydrogen economy here look like in 5, 10, or 15 years?
Yeah, I'm not the technical expert, so I'm not going to speak to what it might look like um, on the technical nature of it. But what I can speak to from my perspective is that success is a regional collaboration. Success is when the four Atlantic provinces will attract more investment because they're speaking with one voice, especially internationally, that we have streamlined regulations that create a faster, more predictable project approvals, can really help with that investment. Um, the idea of having a coordinated training among the four provinces that will ensure a skilled energy workforce, perhaps one that is mobile based on what's happening in each of the four provinces. That will also help with the supply chain, allow for contribution from many different sectors. And I also think that success looks like public confidence in those major projects. And to me, that I think is the most telling nature, is when you have your communities saying, "I want to be part of this." I think that there's opportunity, and we support what's going on in our communities.
We've talked about investment and the importance of private investment and even willingness of project developers to make those investments. But maybe the elephant in the room is price. Green hydrogen is still expensive, and I think it's fair to say that without government funding to help subsidize the cost of green hydrogen production, at least in the short term, it will be difficult to really scale the industry up the way that we want it to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we heard in our episode on hydrogen exports that demand for green hydrogen while demand for green hydrogen in Europe will grow, funding is going to be really important to kickstart the industry. The announced funding that Atlantic Canadian hydrogen producers will be eligible for should be enough to get, two or three or maybe four hydrogen export projects off the ground in Atlantic Canada, but more funding is likely going to be needed to achieve the economies of scale that the sector is going to need, to really be successful long term. And I think the risk is without more funding to stimulate growth, the markets in Europe will develop later and they'll develop slower. And I think it's just more, we kind of, this is our moment now. There is a first mover advantage. And so I just hope that the funding that the sector needs to get off the ground is going to be available and that governments and politicians will have the will to kind of to make those investments up front, um, potentially even in advance of having tremendous public support. We've got to, take the long view of this and say to be successful long term, we're going to have to make some significant investments in the short term. And with all that's happening globally with the trade war and trying to broaden our trade relationships with Europe, now feels like the right time for us to seize that opportunity. So I know governments are also distracted by a whole bunch of other things, and funding some green hydrogen projects in Atlantic Canada might not be their number one priority yet, but hopefully at least the Canadian government and governments in Atlantic Canada will see, this is a good opportunity for us to start to diversify our trade away from the US and to build, stronger trade relationships with customers and allies in Western Europe.
Yeah, I agree, Derek. And I guess I want to put a little caveat on there that, people who might be listening to this podcast series, are interested in hydrogen, and that's their headspace. And I would just like to remind listeners that just because you invest in or, spend a little bit of time and effort to sort of focus, especially a new sector, that doesn't mean that everything else falls by the wayside. And so there is an opportunity to not only pursue a strong focus on hydrogen, but also consider how we're still going to support the rest of the sectors that are going to need that support over the next little while. And the diversification and export opportunities can really sort of generate that maybe flow of cash and new investment into the region, which will elevate everybody. So at the end of the day, it's not just one thing that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. We're going to make sure that each of the sectors have what they need, but pursue something that has that potential to really economically diversify the region. And so I think I'll just end by saying, do your homework, think big picture, and look to your neighbors to collaborate and see how we can create some efficiencies, maybe, so that we can achieve that bigger, broader goal at the end of the day.
Oh, well, we could talk for hours about the future of hydrogen in Atlantic Canada, but I think that was a good way to wrap up this conversation. Michelle, thanks for your time today and for sharing your insights and perspectives.
Thank you, Derek. I appreciate it. It's a great conversation today.
Okay. Maria, in this episode, we looked beyond the future of hydrogen in Atlantic Canada by showing how it fits into something much larger, a big, bold, unified energy vision for our region. In my role as executive director of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance, I spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about hydrogen. So it was nice that Michelle brought a big picture perspective by starting our talk not with hydrogen, but with energy and energy's potential as an economic driver for Atlantic Canada. She reminded us that Atlantic Canada is rich in energy resources. We have hydro, biomass, solar, nuclear, and of course world-class wind. And we also have the infrastructure that energy economies need, like tidewater ports. By my count, Atlantic Canada has 7 significant ports. We also have electric transmission grids and even an LNG terminal. I also liked her framing of Atlantic Canada as a sleeping giant in Canada's energy system. And she said that what might wake it up is a global shift toward energy security and sovereignty, and that's exactly what's happening right now. Countries like Germany aren't just looking for clean energy, they're also looking for energy security by getting their energy from trusted, stable trading partners, places like Atlantic Canada. And her point reminded me of a conversation I had with Lucas Schufelen of BET Energy Consulting in Germany. He was a previous guest on this podcast. The first time I met him in Halifax last November, I asked why Germany is interested in green hydrogen specifically from Atlantic Canada rather than from countries, from other countries. And his response was energy security. Germany doesn't want to become dependent again on energy from countries that may be or may become unstable or politically unfriendly, places like Russia or the Middle East or North Africa. Ironically, we were talking the day after President Trump had been reelected, and he joked at the time that maybe even the United States will be seen as unstable or unfriendly. And here we are 4 months later, and that lighthearted comment has come true. So, Maria, what stuck with you from this episode?
Michelle quoted a statistic from the Atlantic Province's Economic Council that stuck with me, and that was that over $40 billion in energy projects are currently in the pipeline in Atlantic Canada. And that kind of investment could drive significant economic growth. It would create lasting jobs, help sustain communities across the region. And Michelle also made a powerful case for regional collaboration, that Atlantic Canada will go further, faster, and be more successful in developing the hydrogen sector if we speak and act with one voice. Instead of four provinces working independently, we need a unified approach, streamlined and harmonized regulations, shared messaging, and a collective push to promote the Atlantic Canada region as an attractive place to invest in hydrogen and clean energy more broadly. That was my takeaway, Derek. And I know next you're going to be recording at the Hydrogen East conference, and you're going to be speaking to some wonderful people there. And I also want to say thanks for all the other episodes that you've recorded here. And if anybody wants to learn about the future of hydrogen in Atlantic Canada, make sure you listen in on the previous recordings that Derek and guests have done.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.